many more, I believe, who are watching online. For those of you here in person, this is all being live streamed and recorded, and I think questions will be recorded at the end. It is such a pleasure to be at this first, I think, live IFS event in 18 months. Of course, we've done dozens, if not hundreds, online over the last year and a half, but this is the first time we've had the huge pleasure of welcoming back so many old friends in person. And it's also the first time we've done something so explicitly as a hybrid event as well. In terms of the sort of simple housekeeping, Jean will speak for about an hour, then there will be half an hour for questions, and we will take questions both from people in the room, raising your hands in a normal way, and people who are watching online. You have the link to the Slido app, and I will be looking at that and asking them on your behalf, and ones that get more votes will go to the top of my app and therefore be more likely to get asked. So if there are questions there you like, do vote for them. Now that's all by way of housekeeping. I will now just move on to the great pleasure of introducing Jean Tirole, who should feel at home as an engineer. I discovered earlier today that he graduated actually in engineering, but made the sensible decision and the very fortunate decision for all of us to move on to economics after that. And indeed, as I understand it, he was made it into what they call the elite corps of engineers of bridges, forests, and something else, water.
Roads
and roads. Yeah, it's a phenomenal, if you look at his CV. Not only is he a great economist, but a great engineer as well, apparently. So it's great to welcome you here to the Institute of Mechanical Engineers, although I understand he's a civil engineer. But that's, of course, not where he's made his name. As you all know, Jean won a Nobel Prize for his work on regulation and monopolies, and since then has been working just very broadly across economics. And I know that tonight he's going to give a lecture really covering a lot of ground. Also, I think advertising his book a little, which is, I think, focused on what Jean is doing so much of, which is looking at what is the common good that you can get from economics and the study of economics. And Jean is also contributing so much to economics and public policy more generally. It's just fantastic to be working with him on the Deaton Review of Inequalities, which a lot of you will be aware of, and Jean is a very active member of that panel. He's been advising the French President as part of a big commission that he has set up, and in writing the book, The Economics of the Common Good, and now coming to talk to us about the common good after COVID, I think you'll see just the range of his intellectual interests and insights. So with no further ado, I'm going to ask Jean to come up and speak, and then, as I say, we'll have plenty of time for questions afterwards.
Well, thank you, Paul, for those kind words. It's a wonderful moment for me. Just like for you, in a sense, the first time I see people personally in person, as you know the reference. It's really great to be together again, and it's the first time actually I can do it after all those Zooms. And also this annual IFS lecture is wonderful for me because it's like a role model for Europe, I think, and the world, a kind of work which is done for the common good and try to get science-based policy recommendations. So it's a great pleasure to be giving this IFS lecture. A lot of people actually say that given that we have gone through a very big crisis with COVID, now we are ready to actually confront the challenge of climate change and equality and and whatever AI and all the issues we're going to face in the next few years. Somehow I'm suspicious of that. It's a kind of wishful thinking. And what I would like to talk about is how perhaps we can change our institution and also the way we are acting so as to avoid going back to business as usual, which is my best predictor, I guess, for what's going to happen. Now, I'm not going to give you any solution. I'm going to go through the thinking that we might conduct and leave a lot of question marks, but I think it's an interesting thing to do. So let me start with things you all know, but just so that everybody is on the same wavelength with the common good. So on the common good, as we all know, there are lots of things we do which are not aligned with general interest. So as consumers, we pollute too much, we may fail to be vaccinated, we drive too fast and so on and so forth. Same thing, businesses actually and banks may take too much risk and jeopardize the welfare of their depositors or their workers. We all know the states engage in excessive spending and despite that provide poor education often, create financial crisis, don't solve inequality and so on. And I'm not going to mention all the issues that come from my country first. So the common thing with all those phenomena, of course, is that the private interest is not aligned with the general interest, and the economics of the common good is really trying to make sure that the institution forces us actually to align our actions with the general interest. Now, I'm going to criticize that a little bit later on, but I think the right way to start. Now, what are the instruments? The first instrument is, of course, persuasion. So we economists tend to think about incentives, but persuasion is often emphasized by other social sciences. And the idea is really to encourage good citizen behavior so that you should not pollute, in a sense. Corporate social responsibility, socially responsible investment and the like, and do some norms-based intervention. So you try to convey to people information about the consequences of their selfish behavior or the social norm itself. So there is all literature in sociology about how to do it. And that's all important, of course, but it's not sufficient. It's not sufficient because we see that incentives are needed. And if you just take climate change, for example, we have been exhorting people for 29 years now because much of what was at COP21 in Paris was already at Rio in 1992. And we exhort people to actually to change their behavior, and very little has happened since. So at some point you need incentives. Sometimes you can combine both. Actually, a combination of incentive and persuasion can work pretty well. So even in cases where you cannot use incentive because there is no one watching, you still get good behavior. And I was kind of surprised of the change in behavior relative to tobacco, for example, in Spain or in France. I didn't predict that it would work so well, in a sense. Now, defining the common good, I think the best thing we have is actually an old trick, which is a veil of ignorance. We all have a position in society, and of course, we are biased by who we are. And the idea is to go back and just imagine a thought experiment that we are not born yet, and we don't know whether we'll be a man or woman, but whether we'll be born in a rich or poor family, in a well-to-do neighborhood with good schools, in which religion, and so on and so forth, so even in which country. And you ask yourself, what kind of society would I like to live in? It sounds simple, it's complicated as well, but because you really have to abstract yourself from who you are. And just think that you are a random member of the overall population. But even this thought experiment, which is kind of a little bit naive, gives you a lot of conclusions. So, for example, all kinds of insurance mechanism against where you are born, in what family, for example, so equal education, which is a fundamental thing. Equal chances in life is really the thing. But also solve for all kinds of mishaps you might incur in life. Health problems, income, unemployment, and so on and so forth. So get insurance. Of course, you want an efficient economy, so you want all kinds of regulations to make the markets more efficient, supervision, banking supervision, antitrust, and so on. And also you want some kind of regulation of societal interaction, so kind of tolerance with respect to other people's religion or ethnicity. That you get, of course, from the veil of ignorance. And of course, what we want is a long-term vision. I'm going to come back to that, but of course, the issue with politics, and I'm not criticizing politicians, but their main thinking is, of course, about the next election. And that means that that has a number of consequences. Because if you think about what climate change or poor education or lack of pension reforms or inequality have in common, it's always the same point, which is that if you don't do anything for a year, for 2 years, it doesn't matter. You don't see any change, fundamentally. So until the next election, why should you spend money on that? Okay? So basically, this is what happens, but of course, a year plus a year plus a year, that decades of inaction, and those are time bombs. So we social scientists, we must actually push this long-term vision because the incentives of those who are in power, and again, it's not a criticism, are oriented toward the short term. And also without prejudging instruments. So that's going to bring me to my next topic, and one of those instruments is a market. Okay? That is pretty controversial, especially in the country I'm living in, but not only. The efficiency of a market in achieving allocation has been criticized, and many famous philosophers have written books on the morality of markets. They almost have the same title. Those are just two examples by Harvard Michael Sandel and Stanford Deborah Satz. Almost all those books, and there are other famous philosophers who also have written similar books, they almost have the same title, but they have pretty different content. They almost all are concerned with exactly the same examples, markets we may not want to have. But of course, the most famous one is the one of Michael Sandel, which was a bestseller. And here I'm reading from his work. Basically, a wide range of goods and services, including babies for adoption, surrogate motherhood, sexuality, drugs, military service, votes, and organs for transplantation are not to be commoditized through markets. So they are should not be taken care of through markets. No more than friendship, admissions to elite university, or Nobel Prizes are to be bought. Or genes or other life forms are to be patented. Now, I'm not disagreeing necessarily with those assertions. The question is, how do you get to that? And what do you do about it? That's going to be my question. So, in Economics for the Common Good, and thank you, by the way, Diane, for helping with this book, I basically disagree with this approach. Michael Sandel, Deborah Satz is much more balanced in terms of reasoning, I think, but basically I try to identify what's wrong with what's wrong. Not again that I necessarily disagree with the conclusion, that's a different matter. It's a way of reaching the conclusion, which often is indignation. And indignation is not something I like so much. I like it as a warning signal. So when I feel indignant about something, that means that I feel something may be wrong. That's the first step, I would say. But then the indignation should stop there. And what we should be doing is try to think about what's wrong, why it's wrong in a sense, because that's going to help us understand what the solutions are. Moral assertions really can override the freedom of others. So until recently and still today in many countries, sex between people of the same sex or different races was thought of as being immoral by a big majority of people. And they were imposing their indignation on a minority of people without any justification, just because they found that completely immoral. And that's not all right. Okay, you have to explain why at some point. And the second reason why I feel uncomfortable about indignation is that those markets exist anyway. So we should not put our head in the sand. We should really try to understand what to do with it. Because, you know, you can say, I don't like prostitution, I don't like organ markets or surrogate motherhood, fine. But, you know, those markets exist whether you like them or not. So you really have to think about what's going on. So identify market failures, and that, of course, is a central task of economics. And I really think economics is a moral and philosophical science. So the next thing I want to argue, and that will be kind of obvious to many of you, is that actually many of those things are standard market failures. And, you know, sure, you can feel they are completely immoral, but there are also very good economic reasons for not accepting the market as they are. So the first reason is classic externalities. We usually use the term externality for things like carbon emissions, for example, or underconsumption of vaccine or overconsumption of antibiotics. So standard Pigouvian analysis, which is well known. But if you think about it, the same kind of argument applies to other things as well, which are with immoral markets. So, for example, do you want babies for adoptions to be given to the highest bidder? You could have a market for babies for adoptions. They are scarce. And why don't you sell them to the highest bidder? Okay, yeah, I mean, you might feel, what is he talking about? Who is this guy who is speaking now? Well, no, but it's a very simple externality. He's a person who is going to get the child, going to take good care of this child and love this child. I mean, there's a third party who is not part in the contract, just like for child labor, just like for slavery. I mean, it's just like a very basic externality that we don't want to accept. Same thing, I mean, markets for votes. Okay, I can sell you my vote, but it might be a good transaction for you and me, but except that, of course, then there are lots of externalities on my selling my vote to you on third parties. Now, perhaps more interesting is what's called image externality. So image externality is basically the idea that when you do something, even if it's fine for yourself, you actually might damage the image of a group of people. So an interesting example was like 25 years ago, a French administrative court actually used the externality argument. There was this stupid practice, but people seem to like it, where you take a little person and you throw this little person as far as you can in a nightclub or something like that. And that has happened in most countries, actually, until recently. And people pay to see that. Now, why? Don't ask me why, but you know, they pay to see that. Now, the interesting part in the 1995, and you know, if you graduate from UCL, but you have paid for it, I'm not saying paying for the tuition, you're paying for admission, for being selected. Then, who knows? I mean, of course, you know, the value of the diploma will go down very, very quickly. So, you know, it makes no sense. It's just a very classical asymmetric information issues. Same thing with all kinds of market issues we don't like, including price gouging. Okay. I don't know. Maybe I could come back to that if you're during the question time. But of course, talking about market power raises issues about the post-COVID mood. Coming back to industrial policy for good and bad reasons. And there's a whole debate about that. And you know, my own view is kind of in the middle. I'm not saying we should never use industrial policy, but I'm saying don't use industrial policy unless you do it well. unless you introduce the right governance. And again, my experience in my home country is not a great experience, but there are ways of doing it well. The problem with that is that when you talk to politicians, they want to start a new initiative, to create a new chip or a new battery or a new whatever. And at first they don't even ask what the supply is and whether they have the people who are going to make it happen. But also they don't put the right governance in place. They won't put their name on some program, but then they don't check what's going to happen in this program because they don't put in place the right governance. And there are ways of doing that, which I could discuss later on. And then, but more broadly, leaving aside industrial policy, there's the issue about what to do with antitrust, what to do with big tech, and I'll be happy to discuss that. But I would like to keep some time for questions. So let me skip a few slides and keep on talking about what's wrong with what's wrong. Internalities. So standard market failure. People don't stand for their own best interest. Okay? They fail to pursue their self-interest, in general due to some kind of self-control issue. So in general, the reason why we regulate drugs and alcohol and smoking and junk food is simply that people are too oriented toward their short-term well-being and, of course, ignore the long-term consequences. And again, it's a very standard argument. The thing is that you can apply that to repugnant markets as well. So let's forget about slavery. What about voluntary slavery? So I sign with you a contract. I'm well informed, and there is no duress, and I just want to do it. I want to sign a contract saying you give me a lot of money today, and then I'm your slave forever. Well, let's assume it's doable. I'm sure the Treasury will not like that, but so why not? I mean, it's a contract between two people. But of course, the danger is that I would like to have the money right away and discount basically what's going to happen for me during the rest of my life. Same thing. This argument has been invoked for organ sales. People, and I will come back to that. People sell their kidney for £500 or a couple of £100. They have the money right now, maybe for their family actually, and they, of course, later on they are less happy. Opioids, with this scandal, with a free sample and all those things. So that's really very common market failure, which has been regulated in other instances. So there's nothing special to this regulation of such markets. Inequality, okay, other market failure, and finally there is a market failure for privacy. I mean, here now I'm looking to the future a little bit more, and the fact that we social scientists are late actually with thinking about privacy. Of course, that's a topic which has been around for decades and even centuries, but now things are moving very fast. And the marginal cost of knowing everything about you and knowing everything about your social graph, who are your friends, what are your politics, has gone down to zero. It has gone down to zero because you have AI, you have social networks, you have face recognition in streets, you have everything. So now you can know Paul's social network and social graph very well at no cost, which has a lot of consequences. Okay? So the one we economists study most often is, of course, the possibility of using that for discrimination. Labor market discriminations or product market discrimination. So, if they know your willingness to pay, of course, you won't get much consumer surplus. There will be a capture of the behavioral surplus more generally. There is the old Yrjö issue that, if there is no regulation, then you won't get health insurance if you have the wrong genes or if you're already sick. That's an issue, but it's not only in health, it can be the case for labor markets or personal relationship markets. The last four bullet points is another advertising of mine. I'm sorry, I'm selling my book and advertising my current research. I'm not working for the common good here, but for my own interest. So things like, which I think are important. So for example, the violation of a right to oblivion, which is in basically every country's law, many religions, and so on and so forth, which is violated, of course, by the information remaining on websites forever, which means that you don't get a second chance. And that's an issue. Another issue is the interaction between our public sphere and our private sphere. With colleagues, I mean, all that is done with colleagues, but with colleagues, basically, I've started doing the theory, predicting basically that there will be a crowding out. People will pay more and more attention to the public sphere and less attention to the private sphere. That means that your private sphere relationship will be a degraded version of what they should be. And we have some experiments which go exactly in that direction. There's the issue of divisive issues. So there are consensual issues, which are issues for which basically everyone in this room will agree about, like polluting or committing a crime or insulting someone is not something very nice. I hope everybody will agree in this room. But there are other things, also maybe not. Maybe this room is a bad example for that. But there are other things for which people disagree. Like politics and religion, sexuality, abortion, social issue, vaccination, whatever. And that's also something in which an area where you might care about your privacy, of course, because you might want to avoid the hostility of people who don't think like you and might become hostile to you, even violent, possibly. So you might want sometimes to take refuge in a safe space, not exhibit your behavior in public spaces. So, for example, for a long time, gay people, for example, could not enjoy the public space together because they were afraid of being ostracized or violence or something. And they were forced to choose a social graph, which were basically like-minded people choosing the same kind of behavior and the like. So it's actually an interesting line of research because safe spaces also have a lot of welfare costs, ancillary welfare costs, in terms of the kind of narrative and in kinds of actions that circulate within those safe spaces. So it's actually a very important policy issue. And the last one actually is about the social score, which is being put in place in China. And by the way, if you have read the 2021 Artificial Intelligence Act of the European Commission, basically it's going to ban this kind of social score. Of course, it's always also throwing the baby with the bathwater, because social scores sometimes can be useful, but they are extremely dangerous when you mix them with political compliance, when you mix them with a social graph and so on. And you basically achieve at very low cost what the Stasi achieved before. Okay, so market failures, actually that's our bread and butter, to be honest. I mean, that allows us economists to work on something and not say that markets are wonderful all the time. But it's true that by and large we believe in markets, and actually that's why we work so hard to make them better, so because they have efficiency properties. But the standard response, I guess, I mean, you're going to tell me, probably it dates back to Adam Smith, but okay, markets have market failures, you need governments. The governments are going to be market fixers, and everything will be all right. Except except that governments are captured by lobbies. Governments have an election, so they are going to pander to the electorate, they are going to be short-termist. And governments, of course, are local, and of course, there are issues with jurisdiction. So that's difficult. We certainly believe the state should be a regulator. So correct market failures that I've mentioned, the many market failures. It should, of course, provide a legal framework. There's been some problem with the funds here, but fund high risk, high reward projects and so on. The government is not that good at running projects for reasons which are kind of obvious and we could go back to. Now, COVID-19 has been an example of market cum government failure. Now, the market failure is pretty clear. It's a standard externality issue. So in terms of social distancing, testing, vaccination, and so on, of course, we don't necessarily take into account the externality we impose onto others. But there was a huge government failure as well, or societal failure, I don't know, with a lot of short-termism, lack of preparation. It's not only the supplies. I mean, there were lots in the newspaper about not having masks. Actually, in France, we even said the masks are useless because we didn't have any in stock. But all kinds of things. And now one of the issues is, of course, the lack of social compact about the pandemic pass. The pandemic pass is something extremely useful, but there's still a lot of discussion about whether you can impose it. So in France, we have this kind of, I was discussing with Paul earlier, we have this kind of mixed system where formally we are very strict. We have a pandemic pass, but actually it's not enforced. And actually, it's very hard to ask people actually for their pass. It's difficult, but it's a kind of thing we haven't prepared ourselves. And you have to remember, it's not the last one. Pandemics are not a rare event anymore. And there are other coronaviruses, actually, of course, but that's not the only thing. You have a huge resistance to antibiotics with no new antibiotics being produced. You have the melting of the permafrost with all viruses and bacteria being released. You have bacteriological warfare. I don't want to depress you. It's a joyous occasion. We're all together for the first time in 18 months, and well, I will come back to economists as a bearer of bad news. But and then there was, of course, the fact that this decline in multilateralism that we have observed. Fortunately, one of the presidents had been a bit kicked out, but the national interest is coming back in most countries, and that's very scary. You see it a bit, of course, in COVID as well. So, this is something that is coming back. Okay. So let me criticize what I just told you, which, by the way, I believe in it, but still, it's not enough. Okay, it's really the view that there are lots of market failures. We know how to fix them. The governments should fix them. Of course, we know the government is doing lots of wrong things, but this is the right approach. I'm not going to give you a solution, but at least I'm going to raise the issues and maybe call for a new research agenda for public economics. And the reason for that is that our morality and our public policies are very much influenced by cognitive biases. I'm going to go through that slowly. And it affects, of course, mainly the fields which are in direct contact with society. So, of course, being an economist, I'm sensitive to that, but when you see the reaction to the medical professors, to the MDs and so on, what you read in biology on evolutionary theory in the US or climate change in the US, I mean, it's a broader thing, is that there is less and less respect for science. Now, where does it come from? Because, you know, it's nice to say, here is the right policy. And actually, that's one of the things we ask about in the commission that Olivier Blanchard and I chaired. Actually, Carol was there, Richard was there, and a couple of other people from the UK, and they helped us a lot. That, you know, if it's so simple, I mean, take carbon pricing, for example. How come such a simple solution on which there is consensus of almost all economists, why isn't it implemented? And is that because, you know, it's badly designed the way we do it? Is that because it's not explained well? You know, what's going on? So we have to think about the perception at some point. And also the cognitive biases. So the first cognitive bias is motivated beliefs. And we all suffer from that. I certainly suffer from them as well. We believe what we want to believe about the future. And we want to think we have a bright future. We don't want to be depressed. Listen to an economist talking about pandemics. You know, we want to actually think about, we won't have to make too much effort to fight climate change, for example. It's not a pleasant thought. And that's why I think, for example, the green growth slogan, which is in almost every country, is kind of dangerous. And you can say, well, if we can have our cake and eat it too, why don't we do it? You know, we spend on green stuff and then we grow faster and we are richer, so why don't we do it? And it's worse than that, actually, because, you know, people take that as an excuse, actually, for not doing anything. So, you know, we're going to be richer thanks to being green, so why should I put any effort and contribute to the reduction in global warming? We want to believe, we have some beliefs about our society, so we don't want to see our society as being unequal. It's a very unpleasant thought. So, for example, if you think about organ sales, and you see someone selling his or her kidney for a couple of £100, you find that shocking, right? But why do you find that shocking? But in particular because it reveals to you how unequal our society is. You know, and you know, this is something you don't want to see. I don't want to see it personally, and you know, and that shows you. You know, it really shows you in front of your eyes that actually the same thing with prostitution. You say, okay, that poor lady, what's going on? I mean, she's just destitute, and that shows she's willing to sell her body for money. We also don't want to see society as being violent because it's not very good for well-being. We don't want to live in a violent society. So there was this famous episode that I relate in Economics for the Common Good about the death penalty in France. So from 1939 through 1981, the death penalty was used in France. But instead of having public execution, we had execution in prisons without public. Why is that? Because, you know, the execution at 4 or 5 a.m., people brought their children and rejoiced, and they found that fun. And, you know, it was very shocking. Actually, they destroyed the movies that showed that, you know, because it's very troubling, right? Disturbing to think that people go and see an execution and bring their kids at 5 a.m. and have a huge amount of fun, right? So they made it, they tried to hide those executions. So that's a kind of motivated beliefs I have in mind. Now, in that respect, the Economist is a bearer of bad news. So I don't want to, of course, I'm partisan there, I'm biased toward economists, but it's true that economic analysis is exposing our deep values. So, and one of the things is, of course, you know, when when you do careful economic analysis, the way it's done at IFS, of course, then you get numbers. And those numbers are hard to disagree with, and they expose our values in a sense. And in a sense, we all want to live in a society where incentives are not needed, right? It would be a nicer society, except that that's a la-la land that doesn't exist. And interestingly, if you're in other fields, for example, legal scholars are more clever than economists. They don't talk about incentives, they talk about fairness. So when they talk about intellectual property, we say we need profit in order to incentivize R&D, for example. That's crazy. We should not talk like this. We should talk like lawyers and say it's fair. You know, fairness is a much nicer concept than profit and time consistency. Same thing, you know, sanctity of contracts, moral obligation to honor one's promises. You know, it's almost on a religious ground somehow. Now, so we are not very good at studying what we do. At the same time, we have to recognize that we may destroy social norms also. There is danger in that respect, because what we are saying really is that people are not as nice as you believe. You know, they need incentive to work, they need incentive not to pollute, they need incentive to do this and to do that. And which is fine if you can control people through incentives. You know, you can control pollution through a carbon price. You can control layoffs through an experience rating system, and so on. But what happens when you cannot control because you have no police behind is what is an issue, because by exposing the true values, you basically have brought bad news about the goodness of society. And that probably can degrade, destroy behavior in uncontrolled aspects of life. And that's possible that we, economists, we are not only the bearers of bad news, but we also are destroyers of social norms. And if that's true, that's a caveat in our activity. You still need a carbon price to solve climate change, by the way. Anyway, first impression, I'm not going to spend much time on this. We face the difficulty of that people have a first impression, they look at direct effect of an economic policy, they rarely look at indirect effects like general economic effects, like, you know, what happens if you impose rent control, if you have employment protection. It's a little bit the same argument in a sense. The direct effects are nice, and they're also good for equality, so they look very nice. But then if you think about the indirect effect on incentives, then you get into trouble. But of course, people, they just see the direct effect and not the indirect effect. Leakage prime in climate change control. In the report I've written with Yrjö Jahnsson, we looked a little bit at perceptions. As you might expect, for climate change, taxes are upset everybody, but people love subsidies. Now you expect that the subsidy is really a tax, in a sense, because somebody else is going to be taxed. But yeah, the same people are going to tell you, yeah, oh no, carbon tax is a scandal, but you know, I love those subsidies. You know, we had the same thing actually with inheritance tax. It was kind of funny because we asked people, Stephanie Stancheva asked people to, do you like to have an inheritance tax, or should you be let free to give your money to your children? And everybody says, no tax. I should be able to give money to my children. And then you ask them the question, the same people, you ask them the question, do you find it fair if different children start with very different wealth? So, it's a scandal, you know. and yeah, and they don't see the contradiction between the 2 points. And actually, we ourselves, you know, intellectually, I'm all in favor of an inheritance tax, but I want to give my money to my children, right? I'm also schizophrenic, right? But, this is the kind of thing that you have to deal with. Ethical dilemmas. It's very important at the time of COVID, of course. People like Carol, for example, know pretty well about healthcare, ethical dilemma. We have a very hard time in our society to confront them. So, for example, for choices of equipment or personnel in hospitals, of course, any such choice is going to mean that you're going to save some lives and basically kill some others by the very nature of the choice. But you never reason in those terms. You never sacrifice people openly because you have a limited budget. Because that will not be acceptable in society. Society is not ready to do those ethical dilemma. I thought actually things improve a little bit with the shortage of ventilators in Italy and France, because there was a discussion of actually who should be sacrificed. And people were willing to engage. So I thought that was some progress there. And that went, I think, in the right direction. But this is going to be all over the place. So my colleague Jean-François Bonnefond in Toulouse has a pretty well-known article in Science, he's a psychologist, in getting back to the old Tirole dilemma, but applying to the autonomous car. Now when there is a danger of an accident and the driver has to choose between killing himself or herself and killing 5 pedestrians, it's taken like this. There's no deliberate choice. But of course, with the software, which has to be built in a cold state, you have to decide, are you going to kill those 5 pedestrians, or are you going to kill the driver? And yes, they've looked at the attitude of people with respect to that choice. And by the way, the funny thing is that people there, contrary to the standard Tirole dilemma, they say, oh no, let's kill the driver. And then they say, but I don't want the state to regulate my car. That was kind of funny, right, in terms of, they understood pretty well what was going to happen. Poor understanding of statistics is well known, and of course, the difficulty of communication with indivisive issues. So what shall we do? And that's where I don't have an answer, of course, but let me give you a couple of considerations. The first consideration is that statistics don't work. They don't work well, which is terrible because we think the facts are important, and that's what should drive policy. Fundamentally, policy should be based on the facts. But within the population, it's very hard to use facts. Actually, there is this wonderful quote of Marcel Proust. The facts do not penetrate the world our beliefs live, our beliefs live. That's a very nice way of saying it. That's my translation. It's actually nicer in French, but yeah, it's really true. I mean, statistics. You can talk to people about statistics. They don't react. They understand, but they don't react. They forget anyway. And by the way, the whole debate with the extreme right attitude towards immigrants is that they actually quote totally wrong numbers. At least that's the case for France, but it's also the case for other countries as well. You can correct the statistics. It's never going to change the vote of people who actually vote for those parties. It's difficult now. Is that because they don't change their attitude, or anyway they wanted to believe what they want to believe? I don't know. But that's a big issue. Now, where the debate is on narratives. And for an economist or social scientist, narrative is not something interesting because it's not a basis on which to take decisions. Sure, I can find an immigrant who committed a crime, and I can tell you the narrative about this immigrant actually committing very bad crime. But I can also find a narrative about an immigrant plight who actually crossed the channel to actually blah, blah, blah. I mean, I can tell you a narrative which is going to make you feel good about immigrants. And I prefer the latter, but in a sense, none of them is scientific, right? Why should we care about one person? Well, the only thing which counts is the statistics, right? So that's really an issue, but this is a much, much more powerful way of communicating things. Now, what tricks do narrative use? They use wishful thinking, what I mentioned earlier, the hope for a bright future. So in France, I don't know about the UK, but in France, the number of politicians, right-wing, left-wing, who say ecology should not be punitive. Okay, so no carbon price. And it's a wonderful slogan. It works very well. How can ecology, which is a nice thing, be associated with punitions? It's kind of, it works pretty well. Perspective taking, which is what I was talking about, what's called transport theory, is basically taking a person and making this person, in a sense, better than a statistic. And their personal narratives work. There's, of course, a confusion between correlation and causality. As everybody knows, you should not go to the hospital because your probability of dying there is actually much larger than your probability of dying at home. This is a kind of thing that, of course, that's the bread and butter of economists. We are all about causality, and we want to, okay. And something which is very important is excuses, especially for antisocial behavior. So there can be crazy excuses, like many of the excuses we have heard about vaccines, or not. I'll come back to the replacement excuse. A replacement excuse is actually an excuse not to behave in a nice way, but which is grounded. So the replacement excuse is basically, if I don't do it, somebody else will, right? And you can find lots of examples. The Nazis, for example, they use this replacement excuse, but selling weapons to dictatorships, bribing officials to win a contract. The doctors who actually gave opioids, they use that excuse. If I don't give opioids to that patient, the patient will get the opioids somewhere else. The professional athletes taking illegal drugs and so on and so forth. And we also do it in our everyday life. So it's an excuse, but it has some ground, right? Because if there is competition, then it's very easy for the person to switch and get the weapons or the drugs from somebody else. But of course, it's a good excuse also not to behave pro-socially. So let me take a second to talk about flimsy excuses, because they are very important. There's been a lot of research. Some of you in the room will know that research, but I'm totally fascinated by this research. It's called Moral Wiggle Room. One of the earliest papers on the topic was by Dana, Weber, and Kwon, and starts from something which is basically a standard test of generosity or pro-sociality, in which basically you're given two choices on your computer, and you have the choice between a selfish action, let's call it action A, which is going to give you £6, but the other person you don't know, with somebody else in the room, will get only £1. Or you can be generous, and then each of you will have 5. Okay, so the first payoff is the payoff of the dictator, the one who chooses, and the second payoff is the payoff of the second party. Okay, so if I did it in this room, chances are that about 3/4 of you will choose B. Now, by the way, it's entire self-signaling, because nobody else knows. There's no social signaling. Nobody else knows or will know what you have chosen. So it's entirely signaling to yourself, the old Adam Smith internal spectator. Okay? But, okay, I lose 1. I can be nice, right? It's only £1. Okay. Now, For multiple reasons, also regarding preferences where, say, I'm being nice because I internalize the welfare of others, not as much as my welfare, but I internalize somewhat your welfare, at least 1/4 of your welfare, might explain this, but not quite. And this is why it becomes important. See, I mean, there's been thousands of experiments like this done. But consider this. Complicate things a little bit. There is a state of nature 1. And in state of nature 1, it's exactly the same trade-off. I can be selfish, get 6 for me and 1 for you. Or I can be generous and then we get 5 each. There is another state of nature, which is equally likely, in which it's a no-brainer. So if I choose A, I get 6, you get 5. If I choose B, I get 5 and you get 1. It's a no-brainer. Now, where it gets interesting is that I have a button where I click and I can choose whether to know the state of nature. It's completely free. But the question is, if you click, you will know the state of nature 1 or 2. If I don't click, I will never know and I will have to choose between A and B, nonetheless. So what will you do? Okay? Well, do you want to learn the state of nature? Decision theory tells us we want to know the state of nature because we'll take a better decision if it's state of nature 1, at least for 3/4 of us, we'll choose B. But in state of nature 2, of course, we choose A. Now, what happened in the experiment? Do you guess? Well, what happens is that half of the people don't want to know the state of nature, and lo and behold, what do they choose? A, right? They choose A because they have the excuse that they may not be selfish. Because, of course, they may not hurt, actually, the other person in state of nature 2. Now, this is a real bad excuse, right? This is a really bad excuse. And nonetheless, half of the people choose not to know. And then they choose A, of course. Now, this experiment has been done in many different forms. So, for example, there are 2 dictators, and each dictator can, so going back to that one, the simpler one, where there is only one state of nature, but each dictator can basically impose a generous outcome. So if one of them at least chooses B, then that will be the generous outcome. And lo and behold, once there is another dictator, even so everybody is pivotal, they choose A. At least 2/3 at least choose A. But there are also experiments which are closer to life, so real life. So for example, there is a choice of not being there when the charity comes to your home. There is a choice of delegating a nasty decision like firing an employee to somebody else. Even so, you choose, of course, someone who is going to be tough and is going to fire the employee. So those flimsy excuses are actually very powerful. They resonate, and they are very bad excuses, but they still have a lot of impact on what we do. Okay? Let me skip the replacement excuse. So let me conclude because it's going to be close to an hour now. But, okay. So let's see. I don't have, it's interesting. Okay. So what should we do? Sorry, I think I skipped something. Greg here. Okay, so it doesn't move. Oh, yeah. Okay. Oh, yeah. So there are 2 dictators here. Hold on. Yeah, next one. Okay, so. Okay. There's. Oh, so okay. I see. Interesting. So probably you have been confused the entire lecture because I was lecturing on something which was okay. So in the long term, of course, we there are things we can do, like, of course, discredit relativism and post-truth and instill a respect for science. It's very hard. I mean, a country like France, which always claims it's a very rational country with people, you know, they inherit the French Enlightenment of the 18th century and whatever. That's a country of Pasteur, of course. And then there's a very strong anti-vax movement, and it doesn't date back to COVID. I mean, it's an old thing. There's lots of anti-vax in France. Homeopathy, for example, many French people believe it's efficient. There are hundreds of reports of academies of medicine and so on. Useless. It's very depressing. It's very depressing. And actually, it's reimbursed by Social Security and by supplementary insurance and so on. And then you get GMOs. I mean, you know, again, you may be against GMOs, but you know, at least we should have a rational debate, right? About nuclear power. You know, should we use nuclear power in you know, against climate change, for example? You know, we should have a rational debate on that. 5G, I don't talk about 5G. And so, I know, it's just very, very hard. So, you know, at some point we have to invest in the long term. Okay. So we have to invest in respect of scientists. Of course, you all remember 5 years ago, Chancellor Gove saying, I think the people of this country are fed up or have had enough, of experts. Now, this is not unusual. There are lots of Michael Goves around the world. I mean, I can, you know, in each country I can find you politicians who have had similar says, you know, I mean, this one is pretty famous, and it's not new either. So I took a specific date, 1793. So you all know Edmund Burke thing. The age of chivalry is gone. Poor economist. The glory of Europe is extinguished forever. Come on. But, yeah. Lavoisier. So now we have had the conservatives, now we have the left-wing people. So Lavoisier, as you know, was a great scientist, a chemist, and he was sentenced to death by the revolutionary court. But there was a very important experiment he wanted to finish. I mean, that was the common good. Let me finish the experiment before I die. And no, he could not finish the experiment because the president of the court said the Republic doesn't need scientists. Okay? So nothing new here, but that's an issue. Now, it's hard actually to recreate a trust in scientists. So, of course, we know that there are sources of corruption in our activity. And the most obvious one is money. That can actually distort our reporting and our research. There's a temptation, of course, to be a public intellectual. I mean, it varies across countries, but yeah. I also come from a country where being a public intellectual is something very important and, you know, grants you a lot of respect, which is nice, but it also comes with certain stands. And politics, of course, and again, yeah, I'm not blaming politics here, but you know, there is also a danger in mixing what you do in research and mixing your political opinion, which are very respectable on the side, you know, otherwise, because you know, you may adopt very rigid attitudes. You don't want to disappoint your fellow travelers, and even if you don't, there's this issue that you know, people will say anyway, you're saying that not because it's your science, it's because you're left-wing or you're right-wing. And that's when it comes to that, there's an issue, right? Because people don't believe what you say anyway. So, and it's true for an economist, in medicine, in whatever fields. So that's really an issue. So, you know, we have to think more about how to get our act together and make sure we deserve the trust of the people. But also we need to have people engaging with experts, and it's not always easy. It's easier to have a look at a good Netflix series or read a nice novel than reading an economics book or whatever. But we need to teach better at school, and we can make it fun. Actually, I think we can make school much more fun than it is now. I mean, after all, I was mentioning the issue of correlation versus causality. I mean, there is a French guy called Coluche. You may know him. He passed away a while ago, and he was a very popular person. He made lots of jokes with crazy correlations interpreted as causality. And if humorists can do that, why can't you do it? I mean, as a teacher, you can really explain why some reasoning. And same thing for RCTs. I mean, Pasteur did that in 1881. I mean, and it's very simple to explain. You can explain that to pupils in 5th grade or something. It's not that hard. But of course, we ourselves have to participate more in the public debate and try to understand the perspective. So do some perspective taking to better understand what we do wrong, because we do a lot of things wrong in terms of communication, that's for sure. Okay, so let me conclude here. But is COVID a catalyst for change or an echo chamber for weaknesses? Unfortunately, I don't think it's going to be a catalyst for change. I'm sorry to be a bearer of bad news again, but I wish it were. But clearly, we must use not only economics, but social sciences more broadly in order to understand the reluctance of people to adopt policies we find kind of obvious. And, in terms of thinking as a framework, and I've been pushing that, of course, but, thinking about the common good as a way of organizing our thoughts about public policy. In any case, I was thrilled to be giving this lecture. I look forward to your questions, and thank you very much for your attention.
Well, thank you, Jean. That was staggeringly wide-ranging. I don't think when we invited you, we expected to hear quite so much blood and guts. Hangmen and goodness knows what else. That's exactly what economists ought to be doing to entertain and engage the population. We've got 20 minutes or so for questions. I've got a few on Slido, but I'll give people in the audience here first dibs if someone would like to ask a question. Kate has her hand up. If you could say who you are and where you're from when you ask a question, that'd be great.
Hello, I'm Kate Smith from the IFS. So you spoke a lot about the importance of sort of re-establishing trust in experts in science, but also, I think correctly, how statistics and facts are a lot less appealing to people than narratives. And I was just wondering, to what extent do you think that we, as people that work with statistics and numbers, need to use more of a narrative-based approach to get through to people, or is there a risk that actually in doing that we sort of undermine in the long run the method itself?
Well, Kate, that's a very good question. I mean, don't change what you're doing. That's the first thing, is that the statistics and the facts is what matters in the end for policy making. But I think we need to counter all those anti-common good narratives in some way. And if narratives which go in the right direction work, I mean, why not use the same kind of approach in a first step to get people engaged in the reasoning and to start thinking that you might be right. And then in the second stage, you bring the statistics in to say, look, it's not one example, it's robust. And so I will say, yes, let's play the narrative game. It's not always easy, actually, to find good narratives. The populists actually are extremely good at finding good narratives in general. And, you have to think a lot before finding the good narrative. I gave some characterization here, but I'm not an expert in narratives. I wish I were. But I would say, in the first stage, you engage with narratives, and you say, look, this is completely robust, and then but you have brought the people into your reasoning at that point.
Pete.
Thanks. I'm Hitan Shah, Chief Executive at the British Academy, where you're a fellow. We're delighted that you're a corresponding fellow of ours. You talked at the end about narratives and about other ways of kind of changing societies to improve trust. A lot of that analysis was not based on economics, but on other disciplines. How do you think economics needs to work with the humanities and social science, other disciplines, as it were? Some people are critical of economics sort of ploughing its own furrow. How are you seeing the sort of disciplines working together and the future of that in terms of kind of moving forward collectively?
Well, that's another good question. I mean, if you look at all this discussion of cognitive biases and so on, of course we have to work in particular with psychologists and sociologists, and that's very important. It's not always easy here because we have different languages and different methodology and so on, but in the end, it's rewarding. I mean, we created in Toulouse 10 years ago the Institute for Advanced Study in Toulouse, which is a pluridisciplinary institute. I mean, there are other fields, of course, than those three, but I found very rewarding. At the same time, it's not an easy thing to do, but we need to actually bring in a number of things from other fields in order to understand things like, for example, the reluctance to adopt policies which sound completely obvious to us. So that's important. And then we need to do the kind of thing that people like Stefanie Stancheva do, is trying to understand the perceptions. Just to know, I mean, that doesn't mean we have to basically follow those perceptions. I mean, the idea is the economist should not be a pollster trying to know where public opinion is and follow the public opinion. I mean, that will be the reverse of what we are supposed to do. But we have to understand, again, to think about, and sometimes you will notice that you forgot, for example, the fact that this policy is regressive. And then you might say, we need some compensation, for example, so that's useful for that, but that's classical. But also, again, we could do perspective taking and basically put ourselves in the shoes of the people who have trouble with our reasoning and try to improve things. Not an easy thing, right?
I'll ask one that's come in on Slido. Very up to the moment issue. The question is, how does the common good apply to the global allocation or rationing of vaccines? We've just agreed, I think, that we're going to get a third dose in the UK, at least old people like I will, when there are so few first doses in developing countries. How do you think about global allocation issues when you're thinking about the common good here?
Well, that's actually one of the vague things. When I define the veil of ignorance in a sense is, what is your in-group in a sense? I mean, do you think about your country or do you think about the world? I mean, in principle, we should think about the world, but people will go even further. I mean, if you think about Peter Singer, for example, who said, well, but we also have to internalize the welfare of animals and so on. And that, we have to think, where do you stop the veil of ignorance in a sense? And, it's very hard to find an argument for saying, my country comes first. Even so, de facto, that's what's happening, right? We think more about our country, the countrymen than about people in the third world. Now, in terms of COVID, of course, we know that anyway, the rich country won't be safe until the poor countries have their doses anyway. So I think in terms of the numbers, just giving the vaccine, there's a problem with capacity of production, which is a difficult issue, of course. But giving the vaccines to poor countries will be actually a positive NPV even for a selfish country, a group of rich countries. No, that's a difficult issue. But then it's a moral judgment. Where do you draw the line? And that has to do also with another point, which is that the incentive issue, in a sense. which is, I said, the veil of ignorance, you have to decide what the in-group is. So let's think it's everybody in the world, which sounds reasonable. But still you might say, well, maybe there should be a national preference, because of course that's what gives us incentive to actually develop those vaccines and produce them. So, at some point you have to take into account the incentive as well, the way you do it also for individuals, right? Otherwise, for example, you say everybody will have the same salary and the same income, right? At some point you have to bring in the incentives, because you do some kind of mechanism design. What Merlis did, for example, in his paper 50 years ago, you do some mechanism design, you ask yourself, behind the veil of ignorance, what kind of society would I like to construct? So, if there were no incentive, I would like everybody to have the same income. If there are incentives, that's a little bit different, because I want people to be incentivized to actually create wealth and value for society. And you could say the same thing for countries, after all. You might say there could be some national preference, because that gives incentive for countries to develop and produce those goods. But at the same time, if there were no incentive issues, you would like people in Bangladesh to have exactly the same access as people in the UK. That would sound logical, right?
That's interesting, because I mean, it's. I would hazard that that's not the way that many people would think about those issues. I mean, philosophers have obviously thought about this for a long time and have understood that people prefer, they put their family first, and then their friends, and then their country, and then the world. And I think so that there's two parts about what you're saying. I think one is, in a sense, it would be much better if we thought, or it would potentially be better if we had a broader group who we thought as the in-group under this veil of ignorance. But if we don't, then incentives are what might drive it. Might drive a sort of a local preference. I'm not sure that it's, certainly when most people are thinking, they're not thinking about incentives driving a local preference. They are really thinking about it's my group driving that. And I'm just wondering whether you think that's, it feels like we're a long, long way from having the world as our local group for a lot of these things.
I agree, but at some point when people say, no, I mean...
Behavioural economists today.
All economists?
Are all economists behavioural economists?
I don't know. I mean, there are still debates about that. Things have changed, I think. 30 years ago, if you were a behavioral economist, you were thought of as being no one. But then, obviously, things change. And, behavioral economists have a job in the top departments, economics departments in the world. There have been Nobel Prizes awarded to behavioral economists and so on. So, and Clark medals and so on. So things have changed a lot. So, it's still controversial in terms of, because we don't have a unified model of behavioral economics, at least in some field. Things like willpower, it's kind of consensual in the profession that we may be suffering from willpower, which is too small and so on. But for some other things, I hope I'm a behavioral economist myself, but who knows? I mean, my own view on behavioral economics is that I think it's extremely important, and we have to import a lot from psychology and other fields. We have to run experiments. That's totally crucial to understand what's going on. At the same time, I don't want to put behavioral economics everywhere, because sometimes you may have simple agency consideration that explain very well the fact. I mean, there might be some behavioral explanation as well, but if you say, for example, lots of entrepreneurs fail, and one interpretation is, of course, that they are too optimistic, and there is a lot of evidence that actually people are over-optimistic, especially these kind of people who are engaging in that kind of activity. But at the same time, there are also lots of agency issues, risk-taking, playing with other people's money, and actually just the risk that is involved in entrepreneurship means that you should fail actually most of the time. So, I will not just stop and say it's behavioral. You also have quite classical rational explanation to that. So we need to have a broader mind in a sense, and we need I don't want to be a behavioral economist. I don't want to be a classical economist either. I want to be a mixture of all that.
I've got another one from the Slido, which is another great big question, I'm afraid. The question here is, how would you present these ideas to an audience with a different worldview, for example, in Iran or China? And so is there a possibility of a common shared view? And I might add to that by just reflecting on, I know some of the psychological literature will say that, what you have, the sort of way you've described of thinking is very much a Western way of thinking. I mean, irrespective of, autocratic regimes or what have you. But if you go to communities in Indonesia or India or other parts of the world, they just think very differently to the way that you've been describing thought. And is that a problem for you?
I don't know.
Well, you go big. You got big questions.
You can. We economists are going to point at when individualism, for example, is going to go against the common good, right? So, and that's an issue. So, there's still this perspective of the common good and the community. Now, how you define the community, we get back to the previous debate, but there's this view that actually, being individualistic can have important useful effects, but at the same time is going to imply lots of bad behaviors, and that should be corrected in some way. We have tendency to say it's going to be corrected through laws and incentives, but of course people would also say, and not only in the East, they would also say social norms are important. So you can try to change people through a social norm. Sometimes you can, sometimes you can't. I mean, people who try to change the Soviet citizens or the East German citizens and transform them into the new man, as it was called at the time, miserably failed, of course. It's just, but they were kind of hoping at the start. Of course, they quickly realized they were failing, and they started becoming totalitarian, of course. But so where was I? So yeah, I mean, so this is a difficult thing. Now, you can go to China, you can go to Iran, you can go to all those countries and try to explain that. And the common good, again, is something which can be very appealing. Now, whether they will agree with you, but this perspective taking in the veil of ignorance, if they get too religious or too dogmatic about something, you have to explain to them that there might be another person behind the veil of ignorance, and how will they account for that? That's the kind of thing you can say. You don't have to be aggressive in a sense. I mean, Paul, you will not be anyway, but you don't have to be aggressive. You can just say, here is what I think, and here is the reasoning, and then they buy it on. They don't buy it, but I'm not in favor, by the way, of boycotting. I think people in those countries need to have access to dissent in some way. And dissent doesn't have to be aggressive, it just can be a reasoning that you explain, and you try to convince people of that kind of point of view. You can use narratives.
Question here.
Hello, my name is Mariam. I'm from Dubai. So my question comes from the idea of being transparent in research, but also comes from the idea of policing research at the same time. So you discussed, or you mentioned the idea of the measles vaccine causing autism, and we all know how that research got discredited. A lot of people would say that this is because, or the reason why the research was published was because there wasn't enough policies set when that research was published. However, now there's also the issue of being transparent in research. Do you believe that we will reach a point as economists, as researchers, where there will be a middle ground between being transparent in our research and also being able to basically policy, or be able to, policy the research in a way that we ensure that such misinformation does not lead to what's happening now?
Okay, so it's an interesting question. And first, academics are no saints, right? I mean, we are just like everybody else. We of course have a lot of intrinsic motivation. We love our job and so on. But that's not a reason actually to be completely clean. And if you talk about this article in the, was it in a Lancet or wherever, but about measles and vaccines, and there are many others like that. There are zillions of articles like that. There's the fact that you want to become famous, you want your article to be or famous or promoted or whatever, you want your article, you want the glory in any case. And then the referees don't always do their job. They are doing free riding to some extent. And to be honest, you know, I don't always have 3 days to read a paper. And sometimes when I do referees report, I don't exercise the care I should exercise. I try to, but you know, it's not perfect because we are free riders. We get very little reward from that. And all those things, there are agency consideration all over the place in science. Now, but we have to get our act together at the same time. So we need to be accountable, and I think people are more and more accountable for that. They disclose their conflicts of interest more and more, which is good. It's not perfect either. So, you know, it's something that, you know, in the end, we are still exposed to conflicts of interest, whether we want it or not. So it can be all kinds of things. It can be money, which is something I've been confronted for 30 years, because you know we finance our group in Toulouse from money from private and public companies. Now we tell our narratives too, which is that, and I believe in that narrative, but you know that we are actually sufficiently diversified in terms of donors, and you know when they try to put pressure on us, that happens not that often, but that happens. We just say, go to hell. At the same time, what we cannot discount is that once you know the people, you know, there's this personal relationship with the people. And that's something which is much harder to control. You know, if someone tells me, oh, you know, what you are saying there is not right and you have to change it, then I can say, go to hell. But if I become friendly with someone, is that going to affect my judgment that you know, it might. I don't know. It's always the same thing. If I get into politics and I start defending a political party, first I may change my discourse because I don't want to lose my friends. And then again, I get friendly with the politicians and with the party. Is that, you know, there are all kinds of influences like that which are very subtle, and even us honest people actually may be suffering for those influences. So there must be a market somehow and people supervising. And one of the things I'm sure of is that we should not consider we have 2 lives. You know, one life as an academic where we say something and we publish in Econometrica with all the referees report we want, and then one life we have as a public intellectual. And you know, we can say anything and then we can still publish in Econometrica. And you know, and same thing, we can testify in court. An antitrust lawsuit, for example, and say things we would never say in a seminar. I think it's not right. We should not be schizophrenic. And basically the profession should call us back and say, no, look, you're saying this in your research. And then, you know, in public you say things you have never worked on and you have no clue. And just because you want to please some friends or you want to get some money. That's not right. And that's our responsibility. In the end, you know, you can have all kinds of regulation. You also need the social norm, the pressure of your peers to basically tell you this is not right.
Well, that's a fantastic place to end. I mean, thank you for that question, because I was going to ask a similar question, but nowhere near as well. You know, and I suppose, you know, one of the things that we worry about in all of the work that we do is that it's easy for the bad to drive out the good. It's easy to make economists or scientists look like they're disagreeing, because there's always someone who will, as you say, get up there and disagree, almost irrespective of what the issue is. And we've seen that here and various debates around Brexit and around COVID over the last few years. And you know, it's actually very hard to do what you describe in terms of the profession really playing that role. But that's something perhaps we can come back to discuss over drinks downstairs. Fantastically, we are having a short social occasion at the end of this as well. So you're all very welcome to that, and I think you'll all agree there's just an enormous amount to chew over from what Jean Tirole has just said. So join me once again in thanking Jean, and please do come downstairs for a drink afterwards.